The mountains always looked meaner in winter, especially when you were 7 years old and you were knocking on your 12th door. Daniel Reeves's knuckles were raw, bleeding a little onto the frozen wood of the door. The sun was a weak, watery eye in the sky, ready to sink behind the jagged peaks of the Montana Territory. It was 1879, a hard year in a hard place. The town of Silver Ridge was built on rock and rumor, and right now, both were working against him. He knocked again, a little harder this time. The door creaked open, just a sliver. Mrs. Carmichael's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes, usually kind, turned flat the second she saw him. It wasn't meanness exactly. It was worse. It was pity, mixed with fear. "Daniel," she said, her voice tight, "I heard about your mama. That fever, a terrible thing." She pulled her thin shawl closer, a wall between them. "But I can't help you, child. I have my own little ones to feed. Winter's coming on strong." "I can work, ma'am," Daniel said, the words a puff of white in the cold air. "I'm strong. I can chop wood, fetch water." The door clicked shut before he could finish. A familiar ache settled in his stomach. It wasn't the ache of hunger, though he hadn't eaten since a stale biscuit yesterday morning. This was a deeper pain, the kind that comes from hearing the word no so many times it starts to sound like your own name. He clutched the flour sack that held everything he owned in the world. One patched shirt, his mother's worn wooden comb, and a dented tin cup his papa had given him. His papa, who'd walked into these same mean mountains 2 years ago and never walked out. The Henderson family said no, then the Walters, then the Prices. Each door closed a little faster than the last. By the time he reached the edge of town, his hope was as frozen as his feet. Snow began to fall, tiny icy needles that stung his cheeks. He was out of doors to knock on, out of chances, except for one. "Where you headed, boy?" Old Mr. Patterson squinted at him from his porch, rocking slowly in a chair that groaned with every movement. "Just walking, sir." "Nowhere to walk to up there," Patterson grunted, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice that sizzled on the snow. "That last cabin on the hill, that's Samuel Brennan's place." The old man paused, his eyes narrowing. "Don't waste your breath, son. He ain't the helping kind. Hasn't been since his wife and baby died 3 years back. Some say the fever took 'em. Some say it was something else." Patterson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He don't talk to nobody. Don't want company. They say he just sits up there alone, with his ghosts." Daniel looked up the hill. A single cabin stood against the darkening sky, a crooked finger of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Every rational thought screamed at him to turn back, to find a barn, to hide anywhere else. But there was nowhere else. This was the end of the line. His worn boots crunched through the fresh powder as he climbed. The wind howled, a lonely sound that seemed to push him back down the hill. He felt like he was walking into a story the grown-ups told to scare their children. When he finally reached the rough-hewn door, he hesitated, his small hand raised. What if the stories were true? What if this man was worse than just a hermit? What if he was dangerous? He knocked anyway. He had to. There was no other choice. The sound was swallowed by the wind. For a long moment, nothing happened. He was about to turn away when the door swung inward with a low groan. A man filled the doorway, tall, gaunt, with a beard streaked gray like the winter sky. But it was his eyes that held Daniel frozen. They were the color of ice on a deep lake. Cold, empty, and haunted. "What do you want?" The voice was a gravelly whisper, unused and broken. The words spilled out of Daniel in a rush, desperate and fast. "My name's Daniel Reeves, sir. My mama died. Fever. I got nowhere to go. I've been to every house in Silver Ridge. They all said no. I can work hard, sir. I'm small, but I'm strong. I can feed animals and split wood. I don't need much." The man, Samuel Brennan, just stared. His expression didn't change. The icy eyes looked right through him. He started to close the door. "Please," Daniel's voice cracked, a sound of pure desperation. "I'll sleep in your barn. I won't bother you. Just somewhere out of the snow. Please, mister." Samuel stopped. The door paused, halfway closed. His jaw worked, a muscle twitching under the thick beard. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in those dead eyes. It wasn't kindness. It was pain. A raw, familiar agony that recognized itself in the boy's plea. The snow fell harder, a curtain of white between them. In the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing off the frozen peaks. "How old are you?" Samuel's voice was barely audible. "7, sir. Be 8 in the spring." Samuel's gaze dropped to the pathetic flour sack clutched in Daniel's hand, then back to his face. The boy was shaking violently now, his lips a pale blue, his thin coat a shroud of white. Samuel Brennan opened the door wider. "Come inside," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Before you freeze to death on my porch." The warmth of the cabin was a shock. It hit Daniel like a physical blow, and his body began to shake even harder as the feeling returned to his frozen limbs. The inside was sparse but spotless. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. 1 table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, neatly made. A ladder leading to a dark loft. It was the cleanest, emptiest room Daniel had ever seen. It felt like a place where no one had laughed in a very, very long time. Without a word, Samuel moved to the stove and ladled a thick, steaming stew into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the table, the scrape of wood on wood loud in the silence. "Sit," he commanded. "Eat." Daniel sat. The stew was rich with meat and vegetables, the best thing he'd tasted in months. He wanted to devour it, but he forced himself to take small, careful spoonfuls. He knew eating too fast after starving would make him sick. Samuel didn't eat. He leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching Daniel with those unnerving, empty eyes. "You said everyone in town turned you away," Samuel stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. 11 families." "Why?" Daniel swallowed a piece of potato. "Most said they didn't have enough food for winter. Mrs. Henderson said they weren't a charity. Mr. Price. He said I was bad luck, because of my papa vanishing, and my mama dying." Samuel's expression flickered, a brief tightening around his eyes, but he said nothing. "I'll work hard, sir," Daniel added quickly, terrified the man would change his mind. "I promise. I won't be any trouble. You'll sleep in the loft." Samuel pointed with his chin toward the ladder. "There are blankets. Tomorrow, you'll fetch water and split kindling. After that, you go to school." Daniel looked up from his bowl, stunned. School? Most boys his age were already working in the mines or on farms. "A boy who can't read is a boy who can't think," Samuel said, his voice hard as iron. He finally met Daniel's gaze, and for a second, the ice in his eyes seemed to crack. And a boy who can't think for himself gets used up and thrown away by the world. That night, burrowed in a nest of thick wool blankets in the loft, Daniel felt a strange sense of safety. He could hear Samuel moving around below, banking the fire, the quiet thud of his boots by the door. Then, a long silence. Peeking through a crack in the floorboards, Daniel saw him. Samuel was sitting at the table. In front of him was a bottle of dark whiskey and a single cup. He poured the whiskey, the liquid glinting in the firelight. But he didn't drink it. He just sat there, staring at the full cup, his face a mask of stone. It was as if he was performing a ritual for a ghost, a silent, nightly vigil that Daniel couldn't possibly understand. Was this real? Or would the morning come and this strange, broken man would cast him back out into the snow? Daniel woke to a sliver of gray light and the smell of wood smoke. Peeking through the floorboards, he saw Samuel was already dressed, stoking the embers of the fire back to life. The man moved with a quiet, practiced economy, no wasted motion. It was the movement of a man who had been alone for a very long time. Daniel scrambled down the ladder, his bare feet hitting the cold wood floor with a soft thud. Samuel glanced up, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You're awake." "I thought I should help, sir." The man studied him for a long, silent moment. Daniel held his breath. Finally, Samuel gave a curt nod toward a wooden bucket by the door. "The well is 50 yards behind the cabin. There's a path. Fetch water." Outside, the world was a canvas of white and gray. A fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, muffling all sound. Daniel followed the deep tracks Samuel had already made in the snow. The well was a simple stone ring with a crank and a rope. The work was hard. The rope was stiff with ice and burned his bare hands. The full bucket was heavy, sloshing icy water onto his boots. But when he returned, panting, to the cabin, Samuel had a bowl of hot cornmeal mush waiting for him on the table. They ate in their now customary silence. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was just quiet. "After your chores, you go to school," Samuel said, breaking the silence as he scraped his bowl clean. "Mrs. Walsh teaches above the general store. Don't be late." Chores came first. Samuel showed him how to feed the grumpy old mule, Jasper. Then came the woodpile. Samuel demonstrated how to split a log, his movements precise and powerful. Daniel's first few attempts were clumsy. The axe felt heavy and awkward in his small hands. He missed the log entirely on his second swing, burying the axe head in the snow. Samuel didn't laugh. He didn't criticize. He simply stepped forward, adjusted Daniel's grip on the handle, widened his stance, and stepped back. "Let the tool do the work," he said, his first piece of real instruction. By the 10th swing, Daniel managed to split a piece of kindling. A feeling of pride, warm and sharp, bloomed in his chest. School was a new world. The teacher, Mrs. Walsh, was a round, cheerful woman who took one look at Daniel's worn clothes and solemn face and simply said, "Welcome, Daniel. We're glad to have you." She gave him a slate and chalk and a seat in the back. The other children stared. They whispered. During the lunch break, a pigtailed girl named Margaret cornered him by the wood stove. "You're living with the ghost man," she said, not unkindly. "My pa says he's crazy. Says his cabin is haunted." "He's not crazy," Daniel said, a little too loudly. "And it's not haunted." But as he said it, he thought of Samuel staring at that untouched glass of whiskey, and a shiver of doubt ran down his spine. That afternoon, walking back to the cabin, Daniel felt a change in the town. People looked at him differently. He wasn't just the orphan boy anymore. He was the orphan boy who lived with Samuel Brennan. It was a new kind of label, and he wasn't sure if it was better or worse. He found Samuel at a small workbench in the corner of the cabin, a space Daniel hadn't noticed before. He was carving something from a piece of pale pine wood. A small bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. "How was school?" Samuel asked without looking up. "It was good. I learned about capitals. Carson City is in Nevada." "That's right." A thin curl of wood fell from Samuel's knife to the floor. They fell into a routine. Morning chores, school, afternoon chores, dinner. Then, while Daniel practiced his letters on his slate, Samuel would read from a thick, leather-bound book or work on his carving. The small wooden bird slowly took shape, its details becoming more and more intricate. Every night, Daniel would climb to his loft, and every night, through the crack in the floor, he would watch Samuel perform his strange ritual. The whiskey bottle, the single cup, poured, but never drunk. He would sit there for an hour or more, sometimes holding the small wooden bird, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. His face in the firelight was a landscape of sorrow. Daniel started to think Margaret was right. The cabin was haunted, but the ghost wasn't Samuel's wife. It was his grief. And it was a living, breathing thing that sat at the table with them every night. Then, one evening, something changed. Daniel was sweeping the floor when his broom knocked over Samuel's carving block. He bent to pick it up, and his fingers brushed against a loose floorboard underneath. Curiosity got the better of him. He pried it up. Underneath, nestled in the dark, dusty space, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, the cover cracked and faded. His hands shaking, Daniel opened it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. It was a diary. The first few pages were filled with descriptions of the mountains, of building the cabin, of a deep and abiding love for a man named Samuel. It was his wife's journal, Emily. He flipped further, his heart pounding. The entries became more sporadic. Then he found the last one. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "The fever is worse. Rose is so small, so weak. Samuel is out of his mind with worry. He went for the doctor in Benton, a 2-day ride. He said he'd be back. He promised. But the snow is coming down so hard. I fear he won't make it back in time. I fear... The entry ended there. Daniel's blood ran cold. The story the town told was a fever. But this was different. Samuel wasn't here when they died. He'd left them. He'd left them to ride for a doctor. And a storm had trapped him. He'd come back to find his family gone. That night, when Samuel sat down with his whiskey, Daniel saw it with new eyes. It wasn't just grief he was staring at. It was guilt. He was punishing himself, night after night, for a crime no one else knew he'd committed. He had abandoned his family when they needed him most. And the ghost in this cabin wasn't just his sorrow. It was his failure. The discovery of the journal changed the way Daniel saw the silence in the cabin. It was no longer empty. It was heavy with unspoken words, with a history too painful to touch. He put the journal back, careful to replace the loose floorboard exactly as he'd found it. It was a secret he now shared with the ghosts of the house. He started watching Samuel more closely, looking for cracks in the man's stony exterior. He found them in small moments. The way Samuel's hand would sometimes hover over the small wooden bird he was carving, a hesitation full of memory. The way his eyes would drift to the empty space by the fire, where a wife's rocking chair might have sat. Life settled into a rhythm. Daniel's hands toughened from the axe and the water bucket. His reading improved by leaps and bounds under Mrs. Walsh's patient tutoring. At school, the whispers about him living with the ghost man faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance. He was quiet, he worked hard, and he never caused trouble. In town, things were shifting too. Mr. Chen at the general store started saving him a bruised apple from the bottom of the barrel. Sheriff Porter, a man with a tired face and a kind heart, started nodding to them on the street. Even old Mr. Patterson stopped them one day. "Boy's looking healthier," he'd grunted at Samuel. "Putting some meat on his bones. You're doing right by him." Samuel had just nodded, his face unreadable, and kept walking. But Daniel saw the way the man's shoulders straightened just a little. One evening, Daniel was reading aloud from a book about explorers, stumbling over the word treacherous. "Treacherous," Samuel corrected him, his voice rough. "It means dangerous, unpredictable, like these mountains in a storm." He paused, his gaze distant. "Like a promise you can't keep." It was the closest he'd ever come to talking about the past. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to tell him he knew. He wanted to say it wasn't his fault. But the words wouldn't come. The secret felt too big, too sacred to disturb. That night, Samuel did something different. After pouring the whiskey, he didn't just stare at it. He picked up the cup, his hand trembling slightly. He raised it to his lips. Daniel watched from the loft. His breath caught in his throat. But at the last second, Samuel stopped. With a shudder that seemed to rack his entire body, he slammed the cup down on the table. Whiskey sloshed over the rim, a dark stain spreading on the wood. He swept the cup and the bottle off the table with a violent crash. They shattered on the stone hearth. Samuel buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, gut-wrenching sobs. It was the first time Daniel had ever seen him show any emotion besides that cold, empty sorrow. It was terrifying and heartbreaking. The next morning, the broken glass was gone. The whiskey stain on the table remained, a dark scar. Neither of them mentioned it. But the nightly ritual was over. A chapter had closed. Daniel thought, maybe, things were starting to heal. He was wrong. Things were about to get much, much worse. It started with a stranger. A man who rode into Silver Ridge on a fine black horse, wearing a tailored city suit that looked completely out of place among the miners and trappers. He had a clean-shaven face, cold, intelligent eyes, and a thin, cruel smile. He checked into the town's only hotel and started asking questions. Questions about an orphan boy named Daniel Reeves, and the hermit he lived with, Samuel Brennan. His name was Vernon Dodge. He told people he was a territorial child welfare officer from Helena, the capital. He said he was there to ensure the boy was in a suitable environment. Word travels fast in a town like Silver Ridge. By the afternoon, Dodge was climbing the hill to their cabin. Samuel was sharpening an axe blade when the knock came. Daniel was inside, practicing his sums on his slate. He saw the look on Samuel's face when he opened the door and saw the man in the fancy suit. It was a look Daniel had never seen before. It wasn't surprise, it was recognition. And fear. "Brennan," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "It's been a long time." Samuel's face was pale. "Dodge, what are you doing here?" "Official business." Dodge's eyes flickered past Samuel to Daniel, and his thin smile widened. "I'm here about the boy. The territory has a vested interest in the welfare of its orphans." He pushed his way inside without being invited, his eyes sweeping the cabin, taking in every detail. "Quite the domestic setup you have here. Cozy." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. This man wasn't a welfare officer. The way he looked at Samuel, the way he said his name, this was something else entirely. "He has a home here," Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Does he?" Dodge pulled a chair from the table and sat down, making himself at home. "Let's be honest, Brennan. You're not a fit guardian. A single man, a recluse with a tragic past." He let the words hang in the air. "The territory requires orphans to be placed with stable married couples, in a proper Christian home." "I'm teaching him to read," Samuel countered, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "He's safe. He's fed." "Are you teaching him about his father?" Dodge asked, his voice dropping. "Are you telling him what a great man Marcus Reeves was? A thief? A killer?" Daniel's slate slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. His father? A killer? "Leave him out of this," Samuel snarled. "Oh, I can't," Dodge said with a chuckle. "Because Marcus, before he so inconveniently got himself killed in a card game last year, told me a very interesting story. About a bank job in Cheyenne. About a partner who got away clean with the entire score. A partner who disappeared. A man named Samuel Brennan." The room spun. Daniel stared at Samuel, whose face had gone ashen. It was all a lie. His papa wasn't lost in the mountains. He was an outlaw. And Samuel was his partner. "You're wrong," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Dodge leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "The money was never found. $50,000 in gold coin. A man could build a whole new life with that. A quiet life, in a remote cabin, where no one asks any questions." He turned his cold gaze back to Daniel. "The boy is coming with me to the orphanage in Helena. That's the official story. But you and I know what this is really about." He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. "You have until Friday morning to find that money, Brennan. Or the boy gets on a stagecoach with me. And trust me, you don't want to know what happens to boys like him in the places I send them." Dodge walked to the door and paused. "It's your choice, old friend. The gold or the boy." The door closed, leaving an echoing silence. Daniel's world had shattered. The quiet man who'd taken him in, who'd taught him to read, who'd shown him the first kindness he'd known in years, was a bank robber, a liar. And his father, the man he barely remembered, was a thief and a killer. The reason the town had shunned him wasn't bad luck. It was his blood. He looked at Samuel, the man he thought he knew. Samuel wouldn't meet his eyes. He just stood there, a ghost haunted by more than just grief. He was haunted by gold. And now, Daniel was the price. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Daniel couldn't breathe. He looked at Samuel, this stranger who had been his savior. Every act of kindness, every quiet lesson, now seemed like a lie, a cover for a darker secret. "Is it true?" Daniel's voice was a small, broken thing. Samuel finally looked at him. The guarded, empty expression was gone. In its place was a raw, deep-seated shame. He sank into a chair at the table, his big frame seeming to collapse in on itself. "Yes," he whispered, "most of it." The story came out in pieces, dragged from the depths of a guilt he had carried for years. He and Marcus Reeves, Daniel's father, had known each other since they were boys. They'd gotten into trouble, small at first, then bigger. The bank job in Cheyenne was supposed to be their last one. Enough money to start over, to be respectable. But something went wrong. A guard was shot. It was an accident, Samuel insisted. His voice choked. Marcus had panicked. In the chaos, they were separated. Samuel had their rendezvous point, a remote cabin in the Montana Territory he had bought months earlier under a false name. He waited. Marcus never came. "The money?" Daniel asked, his throat tight. "Did you take it?" "No," Samuel said, shaking his head. "Marcus had it. The whole score. I never saw it again. I heard rumors he'd lost it, that he'd been killed. I didn't know what to believe. I just stayed here, hiding, waiting." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "When my wife Emily and our baby Rose got sick. The fever was real, Daniel. The storm was real. I rode for the doctor, but I was too late. I came back, and they were gone." He choked on a sob. "I always believed it was a punishment, for the life I'd lived, for the blood on my hands. It was a confession that changed everything, and nothing. He was still a criminal. But he was also a man who had lost everything, drowning in a sea of guilt." The whiskey ritual suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. He wasn't just mourning his family. He was doing penance for his sins. "So Dodge thinks you have the money," Daniel said, his mind racing, trying to piece it all together. "He always was a vulture," Samuel muttered. "He was the one who planned the job. The inside man at the bank. He was supposed to get a cut, but when it went bad, he vanished. Now he's a government man, using his badge to clean up old debts." The puzzle clicked into place. Dodge didn't care about Daniel's welfare. He was a predator who had smelled blood, using Daniel as a pawn to force Samuel's hand. "But there is no money," Daniel said, a wave of despair washing over him. "You can't give him what you don't have. He's going to take me." Samuel stood up, his face set like granite. A new fire was burning in his eyes, something fiercer than shame. It was resolve. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's not." For the next 2 days the cabin became a fortress. Samuel barred the door and shuttered the windows. He didn't sleep. He sat by the cold hearth, cleaning a rifle Daniel had never seen before, his movements calm and deliberate. The quiet, grieving hermit was gone. In his place was a man preparing for war. Daniel watched him, a mix of fear and a strange, budding hope filling his heart. This man was a liar, an outlaw, but he was also the only person in the world who was willing to fight for him. On Thursday afternoon, a rider came up the hill. It was Sheriff Porter. "Sam," he called from a distance. "Dodge has been talking all over town, spreading stories, saying you're an unfit guardian, that he's taking the boy for his own good." Samuel opened the door a crack. "He's lying." "I figured as much," the sheriff said, his eyes troubled. "But he's got paperwork from Helena. It looks official. He's telling folks he's got the authority of the territory behind him. He's turning people against you." The hope in Daniel's chest withered. It was one thing to stand against a man. It was another to stand against the law. After the sheriff left, Samuel paced the small cabin like a caged wolf. He was trapped. Dodge had built a legal cage around them, and there was no way out. Then Daniel remembered something. The flour sack. The one thing he had from his father. The dented tin cup. He'd barely looked at it in months. He fished it out of the sack. It was just a cup, old and battered. But as he turned it over in his hands, he felt something. A slight rattle. There was a false bottom. His fingers fumbled with the edge. It took him a minute to find the seam. He twisted it. The bottom popped off into his hand. Inside, nestled in a scrap of oilcloth, was not gold. It was a small, heavy, oddly shaped brass key, and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a letter, written in his father's messy scrawl. "Sam, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. Dodge double-crossed us. I knew he would. The money is safe. The key is for a lockbox at the assayer's office in Silver Ridge, under the name of Peterson. It's all there. Half of it is yours. Always was. Use it to build a good life. Look after my boy. I'm sorry." Daniel's hands were shaking. He looked up at Samuel. "The money," he whispered. "It's here. It's been here the whole time." Samuel took the letter and the key, his face a storm of disbelief and dawning comprehension. His partner hadn't betrayed him. He'd protected him. He'd protected the money, and he'd led his son right to it. But the relief was short-lived. A new terrible realization dawned on both of them at the same time. They now had exactly what Vernon Dodge was willing to kill for, and he was coming for it in the morning. The key felt heavy in Samuel's hand, a weight of both salvation and doom. $50,000. A fortune that could buy them a new life, far away from Silver Ridge and the ghosts of Cheyenne. But it was also a death sentence. Dodge wasn't the kind of man to walk away from a score like that. He wouldn't just take the money. He'd eliminate the witnesses. "We can't go to the assayer's office," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "He'll be watching. He'll know." "You're right," Samuel agreed, his mind racing. He paced the floor, the old boards groaning under his weight. The hunter was now the hunted. He looked at the rifle leaning against the wall, then at Daniel. A shootout was a losing game. Dodge was cunning, and he would have the law or his twisted version of it on his side. They had to be smarter. "Your father mentions the name Peterson," Samuel said, tapping the letter. "Old man Patterson. The one who warned you away from my cabin." Daniel's eyes widened. "You think he's involved?" "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "But it's too much of a coincidence. Your father must have known him, trusted him enough to use his name." A desperate plan began to form in Samuel's mind, a long shot built on a foundation of maybes. "We need help, Daniel. We can't do this alone." Asking for help was the last thing Samuel Brennan ever did. For 3 years he had walled himself off from the world, nursing his grief and guilt in solitude. But now, the fate of the boy, his boy, depended on it. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped out of the cabin. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, menacing shadows. They didn't go toward the town. They went deeper into the woods, circling around to the west. Their destination was the one place Dodge wouldn't expect them to go: the schoolhouse. Mrs. Walsh lived in a small apartment behind her classroom. Samuel's knock was soft, urgent. When she opened the door holding a lamp, her face was a mixture of surprise and concern. "Mr. Brennan? Daniel? What on earth is wrong?" Standing in the warm, lamplit room that smelled of chalk dust and old paper, Samuel told her everything: the bank job, his past, Dodge's real identity, the money, the threat. He laid his soul bare, expecting to see disgust or fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw righteous anger. "That man," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "That monster. He came to me, waving his official papers, asking if Daniel was being properly cared for. He was building a case, a false one, to justify a kidnapping." She set her lamp down with a thud. "We will not let him win." She wasn't the only one. Mrs. Walsh knew who to trust in Silver Ridge. She sent a message with a student to Sheriff Porter, another to Mr. Chen at the general store. By midnight, a small secret council had gathered in the darkened schoolroom. The sheriff, his face grim, listened to Samuel's story without interruption. "I knew there was something wrong about Dodge," he said when Samuel had finished. "His paperwork looked real, but his eyes were all wrong. The eyes of a snake." "What can we do?" Samuel asked. "He has the law on his side." "He has the appearance of the law," the sheriff corrected him. "We have the truth, and in a town like this, the truth still counts for something." A plan was hatched, a dangerous, audacious plan that depended on the courage of a few good people and the cleverness of a 7-year-old boy. The next morning, Friday, dawned cold and clear. Just as the sun crested the mountains, Vernon Dodge rode up to the cabin, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He wasn't alone. He had 2 hard-faced men with him, hired muscle from the saloon. He dismounted and strode to the door, pounding on it with his fist. "Brennan! Time's up! The boy or the gold? The door creaked open. Samuel stood there, his face pale and defeated. Daniel was behind him, clutching his flour sack, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. "There's no money," Samuel said, his voice hollow. "It was never here. You were wrong." Dodge's smile vanished. "Don't play games with me, Brennan. I'm not leaving empty-handed." He nodded to his men. "Take the boy." One of the men grabbed Daniel's arm. Daniel let out a sob. "Please, don't. I don't want to go." "It's the law, son," Dodge said with mock sympathy. "You'll be better off in a proper institution." As the man dragged a crying Daniel toward the horses, Samuel slumped against the doorframe, a picture of a broken man. But as Dodge turned his back, Samuel's eyes flickered toward the woods. And that's when the first shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at anyone. It was a signal. The bullet whizzed over Dodge's head and buried itself in a tree trunk. Dodge and his men spun around, drawing their weapons. From behind the woodpile, Sheriff Porter emerged, his rifle leveled. "Vernon Dodge, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and threatening a federal officer." Dodge laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Federal officer? You're a small-town sheriff, Porter. You have no jurisdiction over me." "He's not talking about me," the sheriff said calmly. From the other side of the cabin, Mr. Chen stepped out, holding an old but steady shotgun. Mrs. Walsh appeared on the porch, holding a heavy iron skillet like a weapon. From the trees, more figures emerged. The blacksmith, Mr. Patterson. A half-dozen miners, armed with pickaxes and shovels. They had surrounded the cabin. Dodge's face went white. He was trapped. "This is mob justice," he shrieked. "You can't do this." "We aren't a mob," a new voice said. And from the path leading to town, a man walked forward. He was older, with a weathered face and kind eyes, and he wore the dusty, trail-worn clothes of a circuit judge. Next to him was the telegraph operator from town. "I'm Judge Miller," the man said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "The telegraph operator here was kind enough to wire my office in Helena 2 days ago, outlining some very serious allegations against a man impersonating a territorial officer. Your real name is Vincent Daggett. You were fired from the Pinkerton Agency for embezzlement 5 years ago. There's a warrant out for your arrest in 3 territories." The color drained from Dodge's face. He was finished. His lie had unraveled completely. But a cornered snake is at its most dangerous. With a snarl, Dodge lunged, grabbing Daniel and pulling him in front of him as a shield. He pressed the barrel of his pistol to the boy's head. "Nobody move!" he screamed, his voice high with panic. "Or the boy dies! Get back! All of you!" The townsfolk froze. Samuel's face was a mask of horror. He had walked right into Dodge's last desperate trap. The standoff was terrifyingly still. Dodge dragged Daniel backward, his eyes darting around at the circle of armed citizens. He was out of options, a rabid animal backed into a corner. Samuel took a half-step forward, his hands raised. "Let him go, Dodge," Samuel pleaded, his voice raw. "It's me you want. Let the boy go." "It's too late for that, Brennan," Dodge shrieked, his knuckles white on the pistol. "You and your little town of heroes cost me everything. Now, everyone, drop your weapons. Drop them now." Sheriff Porter hesitated, his rifle still trained on Dodge. It was an impossible shot with Daniel in the way. One by one, the miners lowered their pickaxes. The judge held up his hands. The moment was stretched thin, ready to snap. But they had all forgotten one thing. They saw Daniel as a victim, a shield. They had forgotten he was his father's son, and Samuel's student. Samuel had taught him more than just reading and writing. He had taught him how to read the woods, how to be quiet, how to think. And in his hand, hidden in the folds of his flour sack, Daniel still clutched the dented tin cup. With a sudden, desperate movement, Daniel threw the cup. It wasn't aimed at Dodge. It was aimed at the mule, Jasper, who was tethered nearby. The tin cup clattered loudly against the mule's flank. Jasper, a creature of profound grumpiness and habit, did what he always did when startled. He kicked, hard. His powerful back legs shot out, catching one of Dodge's hired thugs square in the chest. The man flew backward with a grunt, landing in a heap. The diversion was all they needed. In that split second of chaos, as all eyes went to the mule, Daniel stomped down as hard as he could on Dodge's instep with his worn-out boot. Dodge howled in pain, his grip loosening for just an instant. It was enough. Daniel tore himself free. Samuel was already moving, not with the hesitation of a hermit, but with the explosive speed of a man who knew violence. He didn't go for his gun. He lunged forward, tackling Dodge around the waist, driving him hard into the dirt. The pistol flew from Dodge's hand, skittering across the frozen ground. The second thug turned to run, but he ran straight into the blacksmith's outstretched arm, a piece of iron in a flannel shirt. He went down like a sack of ore. It was over. Sheriff Porter and the blacksmith hauled a sputtering, defeated Dodge to his feet, tying his hands securely. The judge stepped forward, looking from the bound criminals to the small boy standing next to Samuel. "Son," he said to Daniel, a small smile on his face, "that was the bravest, smartest thing I've ever seen." Daniel looked up at Samuel. Samuel put a heavy, trembling hand on his shoulder. There were no words, but Daniel could feel the overwhelming relief, the pride, the love, pouring through that simple touch. Later that day, Sheriff Porter, Samuel, and Judge Miller walked down to the assayer's office. Using the brass key, they opened the lockbox registered to Mr. Peterson. Inside, glinting in the lantern light, were stacks and stacks of gold coins. $50,000. A king's ransom. "According to this letter from Marcus Reeves," the judge said, holding the yellowed paper, "half of this belongs to you, Mr. Brennan. The other half belongs to your legal ward, Daniel." Samuel looked at the gold, the source of so much pain and fear. He thought of the life he could build with it. A big house, fine clothes. He could leave Silver Ridge and its ghosts behind forever. He looked down at Daniel, who stood quietly beside him. He saw the trust in the boy's eyes. He saw Mrs. Walsh and Mr. Chen waiting for them outside, their faces anxious and hopeful. He saw the faces of a town that had stood up for them, for him, a flawed and broken man, and he knew he was already home. "The money from the bank needs to be returned, Judge," Samuel said, his voice clear and steady. "Every last dollar. It's blood money. We don't want it." The judge looked at him, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "All of it?" Samuel nodded. "All of it. We have everything we need right here." The story of the orphan boy, the hermit, and the outlaw's gold became a legend in Silver Ridge. They said a whole town faced down a corrupt government man to protect one of their own. They said Samuel Brennan, the man who had hidden from the world, found his courage in the love of a lost boy. The stolen gold was returned to the bank in Cheyenne. The territorial government issued a formal apology and a small reward, which Samuel promptly donated to help build a new, larger schoolhouse. Vernon Dodge, or Vincent Daggett, was sent to a federal prison, where he would have a long time to think about underestimating the people of the Montana mountains. Life in the cabin on the hill found a new rhythm, a peaceful one. The silence was no longer heavy with grief or guilt. It was filled with the quiet comfort of family. They planted a garden in the spring. Samuel fixed the leaky roof. Daniel grew taller, his laughter echoing in the small cabin that had once been so quiet. Samuel never forgot his past. He never forgot Emily or Rose. But the ghosts no longer haunted him. He spoke of them to Daniel sometimes, with a gentle sadness, sharing memories instead of hiding from them. He was a man redeemed, not by forgetting his sins, but by choosing a different path. One summer evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The world was quiet, peaceful. "Samuel," Daniel asked. "Yes, son? Do you think my papa was a bad man?" Samuel was quiet for a long time. He looked out at the vast, unforgiving mountains that had swallowed so many secrets. "He made bad choices," Samuel said finally. "But he loved you. Everything he did, in the end, was to try and make sure you were safe. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. The most important thing isn't the mistakes we make, Daniel. It's what we do after. It's how we try to fix what's broken." Daniel leaned his head against Samuel's shoulder. He understood. He had been broken. Samuel had been broken. The town had been broken in its own ways. And together, they had started to heal. He pulled out the small wooden bird Samuel had carved for him so long ago. It was smooth and worn from being carried in his pocket every day. He held it up to the fading light, a symbol of a promise kept, a life rebuilt. He was home. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't made of gold. They're forged in the fires of hardship and built on the foundation of loyalty and love. What started as a story of a desperate orphan and a broken man became a story of how a community, a father, and a son can find redemption in the most unexpected of places. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tales of justice and redemption. And let me know in the comments below what you think is the most important part of being a family.